The needle punctured the skin just below her left collarbone, and Serah bit down on the strip of leather between her teeth, so hard she tasted copper and old sweat. The ink was not ink. It was a paste of charcoal elderberry ash, and her own blood mixed in a clay bowl that had once belonged to a cartographer who hanged himself in the archives of the Iron Fang pack 3 winters ago. She knew because she had cut him down herself and cleaned the room afterward, scrubbing the ceiling beam with lye until the rope burn vanished from the wood, because that was what the archive keeper did. The dead man's maps were too dangerous to burn and too valuable to lose. So she had done what no one else would do. She put them somewhere no one would think to look. Her own body. The war room smelled of pine resin and tallow, and the faint sweetness of mouse droppings behind the walls. Serah worked by the light of a single candle, her left hand trembling as it guided the bone needle across the ridge of her sternum. The map she was copying tonight showed the mountain passes between the Iron Fang territory and the Black Ridge border. 3 routes through granite valleys so narrow that a wolf in full shift would have to turn sideways. Supply lines, water sources marked with tiny crosses. The elevation notations she had memorized from the original parchment, which was already dissolving because the cartographer had used cheap rabbit skin glue for sizing, and the damp of the underground archive was eating it alive. She had been doing this for 2 years. Every route, every supply cache, every river crossing every ambush point from the 7 maps the dead cartographer had drawn before the rope. The lines now covered her torso from collarbone to hip, wrapping around her ribs, crawling down her spine in a language of thin blue scars that looked to anyone who glanced at them like the ritual scarification some of the mountain packs still practiced on their unmated omegas. Decorative, meaningless, the kind of thing people looked away from because it made them uncomfortable. Nobody looked at Serah long enough to read what was written on her. She was the archive keeper of the Iron Fang pack, which meant she lived in the basement of the Great Hall, slept on a pallet between shelving units stuffed with tax records and breeding registries, and ate whatever the kitchen staff left on the counter after the pack had finished. Tonight, that had been half a bowl of cold potato soup with a skin on top that she peeled off and ate separately because it had the most calories. Her wolf had not surfaced in 6 years, not since the binding ceremony her pack Alpha Lord Gregor had performed when she turned 16 and her shift came into wrong. Too small, they said. Runt colouring. A wolf the pale silver of birch bark when every Iron Fang wolf ran dark. Her mother had been an outsider, a wanderer. Gregor's brother had mated and then lost to a winter fever, and the pack had never forgiven Serah for the foreign blood that showed in her coat. The binding was a collar of spelled iron worn for 3 days and 3 nights. It did not kill the wolf. It pushed it so deep that reaching it felt like trying to touch the bottom of a frozen lake through a hole in the ice. Serah had stopped trying after the first year. The headaches were not worth it. She finished the last elevation, marking a tiny series of dots along the curve of her 8th rib, and set the needle down. Blood and ink mixture seeped through the fresh punctures. She pressed a clean rag against her side and breathed through her nose until the stinging faded to a dull heat. Tomorrow the Alpha King was coming, not to see her. The Alpha King of the Black Ridge Dominion didn't visit basement archive keepers. He was coming because Lord Gregor had no choice. The border wars had bled both territories for 3 years, and Gregor's forces were losing. The mountain passes, the ones now mapped in scar tissue across Serah's body, were the reason. Blackridge controlled the high ground. Gregor needed a treaty, or at least a ceasefire long enough to reposition. The Alpha King Kael Voss had agreed to meet on Iron Fang ground as a show of good faith, though everyone in the pack knew it was really a show of dominance. He was coming to their territory because he could, because he was not afraid of them. Sarah had read every intelligence report on Kael Voss that passed through the archives. She had handled the documents with cotton gloves to preserve them, and read every word while cataloguing. He had taken the Blackridge throne at 22 by killing his uncle in single combat during a challenge that lasted 40 seconds. He was called the Scar King in whispered conversations because the right side of his face carried a mark from a silver blade that should have killed him. His wolf was black with amber eyes and stood taller at the shoulder than a draft horse. 3 packs had surrendered to him without a fight in the last 2 years alone. His reputation was a weapon he wielded as deliberately as any blade. She finished cleaning the needle and placed it back in the hollowed-out spine of a water-damaged atlas where she kept her tools. Then she pulled her linen shirt down carefully over the fresh work, wincing as the fabric caught on the raised skin. In the morning, she would be invisible. She would catalogue the trade proposals Gregor's scribe had prepared. She would stay in the basement. She would be no one. That was the plan. The plan lasted until 11 minutes past noon. Gregor's great hall had been scrubbed and hung with banners for the visit, but it still smelled like what it was, a stone room, where wolves ate meat with their hands. The tallow candles had been replaced with beeswax, which helped. Sarah knew this because she had been the one to carry the beeswax candles up from storage at 5 in the morning, directed by Maren, Gregor's mate, who had jabbed a finger at Sarah's chest and said, "Faster, you useless creature," and then wiped her finger on her skirt, as though touching Sarah's shirt had contaminated it. Maren was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman who had lost 2 pups to stillbirth, and managed her grief by controlling every living thing within arm's reach. Sarah had once seen Maren in the kitchen garden at dawn, before anyone else was awake, pressing her forehead against the fence post, and breathing in long, shuddering pulls. When Maren turned and saw Sarah watching from the archive window, something crossed her face that was not anger or cruelty, but something worse. Recognition. The look of someone caught being human. She had been harsher to Sarah ever since, as though punishing her for witnessing that moment. Sarah was carrying a stack of territorial claim documents through the back corridor behind the Great Hall when the delegation arrived. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on stone. The particular quality of silence that falls when powerful wolves enter a room full of wolves who know they are outmatched. She could feel it through the wall. Not magic, just the way the air changed pressure when too many dominant wolves occupied the same space, like the minutes before a thunderstorm when your ears pop. She should have kept walking. The back corridor led to the servants' stair, and the servants' stair led to the basement, and the basement was where she belonged. But the documents in her arms included the original survey maps from 40 years ago, the ones that showed the border as it existed before Gregor's father moved it 12 miles north and started the war. And Sarah had noticed 3 months ago, while recataloguing, that Gregor's scribe had pulled these documents from the archive without signing the ledger, which meant he was either planning to alter them or destroy them before the negotiation. She needed to get them back to the archive. She needed to move quickly. She turned the corner at the junction where the back corridor met the main hall, and the stack of documents caught the edge of a stone pillar and exploded out of her arms like startled birds. Paper scattered across the floor in a wide arc. One sheet, a hand-drawn elevation profile of the northern pass, slid across the polished stone and came to rest against a boot. The boot was black leather, scarred across the toe, with a mark that looked like it had been made by a blade. The leg above it was wrapped in dark traveling leather. Sarah's gaze travelled up without her permission, past the belt, with its single-sheathed knife, past the broad chest under a coat that smelled of road dust, and something else, something that hit her like a physical blow to the sternum. Cedar smoke. Night rain on granite. The particular ozone smell of lightning about to strike. Her wolf, the one she had not felt in 6 years, the one buried under iron, and silence and resignation, woke up. It did not stir. It did not stretch. It detonated. A white-hot flare behind her ribs that made her gasp and stagger back against the wall. Her vision went sharp and strange colors too bright, and she could suddenly hear the heartbeats of every wolf in the hall. 40, 50, all running fast, except one. The man standing above the scattered papers had a heartbeat that was slow and steady and loud, a bass drum in a room full of snare rolls. Sarah looked up and met his eyes. Amber, not the warm amber of honey or whiskey, though every romance she had read in the archive used those comparisons. These were the amber of tree resin, with something ancient trapped inside. Old, knowing, and currently locked onto her face with an intensity that made every survival instinct she had scream at her to run. The right side of his face carried the scar she had read about. It started at his temple and carved down through his cheekbone, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent half-expression that could be read as either a smile or a snarl depending on the light. His hair was black and cut short, military functional, and his jaw was dark with 2 days of stubble. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of stories, but in the real way, the way that a man who had spent his life fighting and winning was simply larger than a man who had not. He filled the corridor. Kael Voss, the Alpha King of Blackridge. He was staring at her. Not the way people usually stared at her, which was to say, through her. He was staring the way you stare at a word in a foreign language that you almost, but cannot quite, translate. His nostrils flared. "Who?" he said, and his voice was low and rough and unhurried, as though he had all the time that had ever existed. "Are you?" Sarah's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her wolf was howling inside her skull, a sound she had not heard in 6 years, and it was saying a word she did not want to hear. A word she had read about in the mating registries she catalogued every autumn. A word that meant the end of every plan she had ever made to survive by being invisible. Mate. "Nobody," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I am the archive keeper. I apologize for the disruption, Alpha King." She dropped to her knees, not out of protocol, but because her legs were about to give out, and kneeling was better than collapsing. She began gathering papers with hands that shook so badly the pages rattled. A hand entered her field of vision. Large. The knuckles scarred the fingers calloused in specific places that told her he still held weapons daily, not ceremonially. He picked up the elevation profile that had landed against his boot and studied it. Sarah's blood crystallized. That map showed the Northern Pass. The real Northern Pass, not the version Gregor's scribe had altered. If the Alpha King of Blackridge recognized what he was looking at, he would know that Gregor had been lying about the territorial boundary for decades. Kael Voss looked at the map. He looked at Sarah, his head tilted. "You are bleeding," he said. She looked down. The fresh tattoo work from last night had opened under her shirt. A thin line of blood had seeped through the linen below her collarbone, a dark, spreading stain like the beginning of a sentence. "It is nothing," she said. "You are bleeding," he repeated, and his voice had changed. Harder. A tone she recognized from the intelligence reports, the tone he used before he broke things. "And you are afraid of me. But not the way the others in this hall are afraid of me. You are afraid I will look too closely." Her heart stopped, restarted. "I am afraid of nothing, Alpha King. I am only an archive keeper who dropped her papers." He handed the elevation profile back to her. His fingers brushed hers during the exchange. The contact lasted less than a second. In that second, her wolf slammed against the inside of her chest so hard she felt her ribs creak, and his eyes went wide, the amber flooding outward until it swallowed the whites. And she knew his wolf had felt it too. "Chaol." Someone called from the great hall, one of his commanders. "Gregor is waiting." The Alpha King did not move. He stood in the corridor with a scattered Omega archive keeper at his feet, and he did not move. "What is your name?" he said. "Sarah." "Sarah." He said it like he was tasting it, testing the weight. "You will be at the banquet tonight." "I am not permitted at pack events, Alpha King." That was not a question. He stepped over the scattered papers and walked into the great hall, and Sarah knelt on the cold stone floor with her arms full of documents, and her wolf screaming, and the bloodstain on her shirt spreading like a map of its own. She did not go to the banquet. She went to the basement. She locked the archive door. She sat on her pallet with her back against the shelving unit, and her hands pressed flat against the floor, counting the heartbeats she could hear through the stone. The binding on her wolf was fracturing. She could feel its hairline cracks running through the suppression like ice breaking up in spring, and every crack leaked sensation. She could smell the venison being roasted 2 floors above her. She could hear Gregor's toast, his voice booming and false. She could hear impossibly a single heartbeat among 50 that was slower than the rest, steady as a metronome, and she knew whose it was. At 9 that evening, footsteps descended the servants' stair. Not Maren's footsteps, not the cook's. These were heavy and deliberate, and accompanied by a scent that slipped under the archive door and filled the room like smoke. A knock. 3 times. "The door is locked," Sarah said, because she could not think of anything else to say. "I know," said the Alpha King of Black Ridge from the other side. "I can smell the iron in the latch. I can also smell you, your blood, the ink on your hands, the fear which smells like burnt almonds in case you were curious." A pause, and under all of that, something else. Something your people have been trying to bury for a very long time. She said nothing. "You are my mate," Chaol Voss said. Plainly, without drama, the way you state a geographical fact. The river runs south. The mountain is granite. You are my mate. I felt it the moment I walked into this wretched corridor, and your scent hit me like a wall. My wolf has been trying to break my control for the last 7 hours, and I have been sitting through a banquet where your Alpha served me wine that was corked and venison that was oversalted, and I have smiled and nodded and negotiated in good faith, while every cell in my body was oriented toward this basement like a compass needle. Sarah pressed her hands harder against the floor. "I cannot be your mate," she said. "And yet, I am an Omega, a bound Omega. My wolf has been suppressed. I have no rank, no family, no standing. Lord Gregor would never permit it." "Lord Gregor," Chaol said, and something dangerous moved through his voice, "does not permit or deny anything where I am concerned. Open the door, Sarah." "No." Silence. She heard him shift his weight, heard the creak of leather, heard impossibly the sound of his breathing change, slow down and become deliberate. He was controlling himself. The Alpha King of Black Ridge, who had killed his uncle in 40 seconds and made 3 packs surrender on reputation alone, was standing outside a basement door, practicing breathing exercises, so he would not tear it off its hinges. "Then I will sit here," he said, "until you do. You have a treaty to negotiate. Treaties are patient. Gregor will notice you are missing." "Good." She heard him lower himself to the floor. The stone protested under his weight. His back settled against the door, and she could feel the warmth of him through the old wood, an absurd radiating heat that made her press her palm flat against the surface before she could stop herself. "Tell me one thing," he said. His voice was different now, quieter. "The blood on your shirt, the pattern of it. It was not random. It was lines. Deliberate lines." Her hand dropped from the door. "Tell me what you are hiding under that shirt, and I will leave you alone tonight." "It is nothing." "You are a terrible liar, Sarah. Your heartbeat changes when you lie. The pitch goes up and the interval shortens. I have been listening to it for 7 hours." She closed her eyes. Her wolf was pressing against the fractures in the binding, pressing toward the door, toward the heat, toward the heartbeat on the other side. "Maps," she said. The silence that followed was different, charged. "Maps," he repeated. "Your cartographer, the one who worked for Gregor before the border wars. He drew 7 maps of every strategic route between your territory and ours. Mountain passes, supply lines, water sources, ambush positions. When he died, the maps were stored in the archive. They are on unstable paper, dissolving. In another year they will be gone. I copied them. Onto your skin. There was nowhere else safe. Gregor's scribe has been pulling documents from the archive, altering records, destroying anything that contradicts his version of the border. The original maps would have been next." She pressed her forehead against the door. "I was not protecting your territory. I was preserving the record. That is what archive keepers do." A long silence. "You carved military intelligence into your own body," Kyle said slowly, "to preserve the historical record?" "Yes." "And you have been doing this for how long?" 2 years. Another silence. Then a sound she did not expect. A breath that might have been a laugh. Not mocking. Something else. Something that sounded impossibly like wonder. "Open the door, Sarah." "I told you no." "You did. But you also just told me that you carry the strategic key to a war that has killed hundreds of my wolves, and you are sitting behind a locked door in a basement where a man who is apparently falsifying territorial records could find you at any moment. I am not asking to claim you. I am asking to keep you alive through the night." She thought about that. "You promise you will not break the door?" "I promise." "You promise you will not touch me?" "I will not touch you unless you ask me to." She stood. She crossed the small room. She turned the iron latch. Cale Voss filled the doorway the way he had filled the corridor, except now the light was different. The single candle in the archive threw warm shadows across his face, softening the scar, catching the amber of his eyes. He looked at the tiny room, the pallet on the floor, the shelves stuffed with crumbling documents, the bowl on the overturned crate that held the remains of cold potato soup. Something moved across his face. Not pity, fury. It was a quiet fury, the kind that did not shout or snarl, the kind that settled into the jaw and the shoulders and the hands, and stayed. "This is where you live," he said. "This is where the archive keeper lives. And they feed you." He looked at the bowl. "This. When they remember." His eyes moved to her shirt, to the blood stain which had dried to a dark brown map of its own rust-colored lines radiating outward from her collarbone. "May I see?" he asked. She should have said no. Every rational thought told her to say no, but her wolf was pressing against the binding so hard that the cracks were widening, and the warmth radiating from him was the warmth of a banked fire, and she was so tired of being cold. She unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of her shirt and pulled the collar to the left. The lines started at her collarbone, thin blue-black marks, precise and deliberate, curving and branching like a river system. Elevation notations in tiny numbers, supply cache symbols she had invented herself because the cartographer's originals were too large. Route indicators marked by subtle variations in line thickness that distinguished footpath from wagon road from cavalry approach. It was beautiful in a way that maps are beautiful, the reduction of a vast, dangerous landscape into something that could be held and read and understood. Cale stepped closer. He did not touch her. He looked. His eyes moved across the lines with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it on her own face, reflected in the polished metal of the archive's filing cabinets, when she found a document that mattered. The expression of someone reading something that changed what they knew. "This is the Northern Pass," he said, pointing without touching. "The real one. Not the version Gregor presented in the treaty documents tonight." Yes, Gregor's maps show the pass 12 miles further north, which means his territorial claim extends across land that has been Blackridge for a century. Yes. Cale looked at her face. You know what this means. It means the war was based on a lie. Gregor's father falsified the border. Every wolf who has died in the mountain passes died for 12 miles of stolen ground. And you have been carrying this. Someone had to. He reached for her face, stopped. His hand hung in the air between them, close enough that she could feel the heat of his palm. "I promised I would not touch you," he said. "You did." His hand dropped. "We will talk more in the morning," he said. "I am going to have one of my wolves bring you food. Real food. And a lock for this door that cannot be opened from the outside. Gregor will notice. I hope he does." He turned and walked up the stairs, and Serah stood in her archive with her shirt unbuttoned and her wolf keening, and the strange lingering warmth of him still hanging in the air like the last note of a song she had forgotten she knew. The food arrived 20 minutes later. A Blackridge wolf, a young woman with a shaved head and a scar across her nose, brought a tray down the servant's stair without a word. Roast chicken, still warm from the kitchen. Bread with actual butter, a wedge of sharp cheese, an apple. Sarah ate all of it. She ate the chicken down to the bones, and then cracked the bones and sucked the marrow because she had learned years ago that marrow was where the real nutrition lived, and her body needed all of it. The bread she tore into pieces and dipped in the butter until the butter was gone. The apple she ate core and all seeds and stem everything. Then she slept, and for the first time in 6 years, she dreamed of running on 4 legs through a forest. She did not recognize her coat, pale silver in the moonlight, and beside her, matching her stride, a black wolf, the size of a horse, with amber eyes that burned. In the morning, Gregor summoned her. She knew it was bad because he sent Maren. Maren came down the stairs in a dress that smelled of lavender water and iron supplements, which Sarah had never noticed before. But now, with her wolf pressing against the crumbling binding, she could pass scents, like words on a page. Iron supplements meant Maren was anemic. Had been for a while. The stillbirths, probably. "Lord Gregor wants you in the war room," Maren said. Her voice was flat. Her eyes moved to the tray of clean-picked chicken bones, and something shifted in her expression, a flicker. Not suspicion, exactly. Closer to a question she decided not to ask. "Now," Maren added. The war room was on the 2nd floor of the great hall, a hexagonal stone chamber, with a table carved from a single oak trunk, and walls hung with weapons that had not been used in living memory. Gregor was standing behind the table. He was a big man, as all alphas were, but where Cale Voss was big in the way of a wolf that hunted, Gregor was big in the way of a wolf that ate, thick through the middle, florid. His beard was oiled, and his eyes were the pale blue of ice that had been frozen for so long it had forgotten it was water. Beside him stood his scribe Aldrich, a thin man with spectacles, and the particular posture of someone who had made a career of bending toward power. Aldrich was the one who had been pulling documents from the archive. Sarah had watched him do it, logging each removal in a private ledger she kept inside the hollowed-out atlas with her tattooing tools. Cale Voss was also in the room. He stood on the opposite side of the table from Gregor, and the distance between them was the kind of distance that men maintain when they do not want to be tempted to close it with violence. Two of his commanders flanked him, hard-faced wolves in travelling leather. The young woman with the shaved head stood by the door. Cale looked at Sarah when she entered. His face gave nothing away, but she felt it, the pulse through the fraying bond, the tug behind her ribs, and she saw his left hand close into a fist at his side, and then deliberately open. "Archive Keeper," Gregor said, "the Alpha King has requested access to our territorial records, original surveys, border agreements. I have told him that our archive is a disaster, disorganized, unreadable. Is that correct?" He was telling her what to say. "Lord Gregor," she began. "Is that correct?" Gregor repeated. His alpha command pressed against her. Not the full force she was too low-ranking for him to bother, but enough. A thumb on a nerve. She felt her spine want to curve. Cale's slow heartbeat, which she could hear now as clearly as her own, ticked one beat faster. "The archive is well organized," Sarah said. "Every document is catalogued and cross-referenced. I completed a full reorganization 18 months ago." The silence in the war room developed teeth. Gregor looked at her. His pale eyes narrowed. For one moment, Sarah saw something unexpected in them. Not rage, fear. He was afraid of what she knew. He had always been afraid of what she knew, and that fear was the reason she lived in a basement and ate cold soup and had been bound at 16. Not because her wolf was wrong-colored, because even then, even at 16, she had been the one who read everything, remembered everything, understood the implications of everything. He was afraid of the girl who lived in the basement with his secrets. "The archive keeper is confused," Aldrich said smoothly. "The reorganization she mentions was partial. Many of the older surveys remain in deteriorated condition." "I can show the Alpha King the documents myself," Sarah said, "if he would like to verify." Gregor's Alpha command hit her like a slap, full force this time. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe, her vision greying her wolf, snarling behind the binding so hard that she felt the spelled iron collar's ghost around her throat, the phantom pressure of a restraint that had been removed years ago, but never really left. The oak table cracked. Sarah blinked. Cale Voss had put his hand on the table, and the table had cracked. Not split. Not broken. Cracked a single fissure running from under his palm to the table's edge through 8 inches of solid oak. "Lord Gregor," Cale said. His voice was the same low, unhurried tone he always used, but underneath it something was breathing. Something that made every wolf in the room go still. "Did you just use Alpha Command on an Omega in my presence?" "She is my pack member," Gregor said. "I will discipline as I see fit." "She is your pack member who lives in your basement, who eats your scraps, whose wolf you bound when she was a child." Cale's amber eyes had gone molten. "And who appears to know more about your territorial records than your own scribe, which makes me curious about what else she knows that you would prefer she did not say." Gregor's face had gone the color of raw steak. You overstep, Alpha King. I have not yet begun to step. Chaol looked at Serah. Show me the archive. Gregor moved to block the door. It was a mistake, not because Chaol responded with violence, but because the two commanders behind him shifted their weight simultaneously, a synchronized motion that communicated without a word being spoken, that violence was available and calibrated and waiting. Gregor! Chaol's voice dropped, not louder, quieter, the most dangerous register. I came here to negotiate a treaty in good faith. If your territorial claims are legitimate, you have nothing to fear from an archive keeper and some old maps. If they are not... He left the sentence unfinished. The crack in the table finished it for him. Gregor stepped aside. Serah led the Alpha King of Blackridge down the servants' stair to the basement archive. She could feel Gregor's gaze on her back like a brand. She could feel the future narrowing choices, closing off paths, collapsing until only one remained. In the archive she lit 3 candles. The room was too small for Chaol. He stood in the center with his head nearly touching the ceiling, and his shoulders brushing the shelves on either side, and his scent filled the space until she could barely think. Show me, he said. She pulled the territorial surveys from their proper shelf. The originals, the ones Aldrich had not yet managed to destroy, because Serah had made copies of the copies and hidden the originals inside a hollowed-out volume of breeding registries from 1847 that no living person had ever requested. She laid them on the catalogue table. Then she pulled her shirt over her head. She stood in the candlelight in her binding cloth and her scars. The maps covered her torso. 7 maps interconnected a living atlas of the disputed territory, inked in blood and ash across her skin. The mountain passes flowed along her ribs. The supply lines tracked down her spine. The river crossings dotted her stomach. The ambush positions, the ones that had killed hundreds of wolves on both sides, were marked in tiny, precise symbols along the curve of her waist. Chaol stood very still. His eyes moved across her body, the way they had moved the night before, reading, but this time he was closer. Close enough that she could feel his breath on her shoulder. Close enough that her wolf pressed against the binding so hard that something finally irreversibly gave way. The binding shattered. Not metaphorically. The spelled iron that had been holding her wolf under for 6 years fractured like glass. She felt it go a bright, sharp pain behind her sternum that made her cry out and double over. And then her wolf was there, fully present for the first time since she was 16, and it was not small. It was not weak. It was not wrong. It filled her consciousness like floodwater, powerful and silver-white and ancient, and it looked at the wolf behind Chaol's amber eyes and recognized it with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely. Mate. Not a question. A geological fact. Chaol caught her before she hit the floor. His hands on her bare arms, steady and warm. His wolf surged to his eyes, black and immense, and she could see it through the amber looking at her with an expression that wolves should not be able to make, but that she understood anyway. There you are. Your wolf, he said. His voice was rough. You said it was bound. It was. It is not anymore. No. He looked down at his hands on her arms, at the maps that continued down her biceps, the supply route notations that curled around her elbows. He traced a line with his thumb, the northern pass approach, following it from her shoulder down to her elbow. And the touch was so careful, so precise, so completely unlike the violence he was known for, that Serah felt her eyes burn. You carried a war on your body, he said. I carried a record. You carried the proof that Gregor started this war over stolen land. You carried it for 2 years on your skin, where anyone could have found it, and killed you for it." His hands tightened on her arms, not painfully, anchoring. Why? Because someone had to remember the truth. He looked at her face, at her eyes, which were grey and wet and probably red-rimmed from the binding breaking, at her sharp collarbones and her thin shoulders and the scars that were not scars, but a cartography of courage that he was only beginning to read. "I am going to end this war today," he said. "I am going to use what you have shown me to prove that Gregor's territorial claims are false. He will be stripped of his title and his lands. His pack will be absorbed into Blackridge. Yes, and you," he said. "You will come with me. I did not do this for you. I know. You did it for the dead cartographer, and the old maps and the principle that records should not be destroyed by powerful men who find them inconvenient." The corner of his mouth moved. The scarred side. It made the half-expression tilt toward something that was almost a smile. "That is why I am asking and not telling. You do not ask. You are the Alpha King." "I am asking you." She looked at him, at the scar and the amber eyes and the careful hands and the wolf behind them that was watching her with a patience that seemed entirely inconsistent with a man who had ended a challenge in 40 seconds. "What happens to my pack?" she asked. "The ones who are not Gregor, the ones who looked away while I ate scraps and lived in basements, but did not actively choose cruelty. The ones who were just afraid. They will be given the choice to join Blackridge or leave peacefully. And Gregor, that depends on what he does next." What Gregor did next was send 12 wolves to the basement. They came down the servants' stair at dusk. Sarah heard them before they reached the bottom step, because her wolf was fully awake now, fully present, and every sense was crystalline. 12 heartbeats, the smell of steel and adrenaline, and the specific metallic tang of wolves who had been ordered to do something they knew was wrong. Cale was not there. He had gone back to the Great Hall to confront Gregor with the evidence bringing the original surveys and 3 of his commanders. He had left the young woman with the shaved head, whose name was Rin, posted at the top of the servants' stair. Rin's heartbeat was the 13th. It was fast and getting faster. Sarah pulled her shirt on and moved to the door. Through the wood she heard a scuffle, a grunt, a body hitting stone. Then Rin's voice strained. "The Alpha King has claimed this woman under protection of Blackridge. Touch her, and you declare war." "We are already at war," said a voice Sarah recognized. Aldrich the scribe. Aldrich, who had been altering records for years. Aldrich, who understood, perhaps better than Gregor, exactly how dangerous an archive keeper with a good memory could be. "The Alpha King wants the girl because of what she carries," Aldrich said. "If we remove what she carries, there is nothing to negotiate with. Gregor remains Alpha. The border remains where it is. Remove what she carries." Sarah's hand went to her chest. They were not here to kill her. They were here to skin her. She looked around the archive. She had spent 6 years in this room. She knew every shelf, every crumbling book, every hollowed-out atlas. She knew the dimensions. She knew the ceiling beam was load-bearing because she had watched the builders reinforce it 3 years ago. She knew the shelving units were bolted to the walls with iron brackets. She also knew that her wolf, the one that had been bound for 6 years and was now fully awake, was not a runt, had never been a runt. The binding had compressed something enormous into something small, and now that it was free, it was expanding, pressing against her skin, filling the space behind her ribs with silver light. The archive door splintered inward. Sarah shifted. It was not the shift of a wolf who had practiced. It was messy, violent, her clothing tearing her body, rearranging itself in a way that was painful, because the channels it needed to flow through had been unused for 6 years and had calcified. But it was also unstoppable, like water through a cracked dam, like a tree root splitting stone. The wolf that stood in the archive was not small. It was not birch bark silver. It was white, true white, the white of fresh snow under moonlight, the white that only appeared in wolves of the old blood, the bloodline that had founded the first packs before territories had names. Its eyes were not grey. They were silver, bright as mercury, and they reflected the candlelight with a luminescence that made 2 of the 12 wolves at the door step backward. Aldrich did not step backward. He was not a wolf. He was a human scribe with a knife, and humans with knives do not have the instinct to submit to a dominant wolf. He lunged. Sarah caught his arm in her jaws. She did not bite down. She held him. He screamed because even without pressure, a wolf's mouth around your arm is the most terrifying thing most humans will ever experience. And she felt his pulse through his skin and his fear through his scent. And she held him carefully, precisely the way you hold a document you do not want to tear. Then a sound came down the stairs that made every wolf in the corridor flatten. A howl, deep and long and black, if black could be a sound. It poured down the stone stairwell like water, like smoke, like a pronouncement from a throat that could not be disobeyed. The Alpha King's howl. Cale Voss calling from the great hall, and his voice carried not just dominance, but something older. Something that spoke to the wolf part of every shifter in the building, and said simply, "Mine. Mine. Mine." Sarah released Aldrich. He crumpled against the wall, cradling his arm. The 12 wolves were already on the floor. Some shifted, some half-shifted, all submitting. The howl was not a request. Footsteps on the stairs, not hurried, but not slow. Cale came around the corner in the doorway and stopped. He looked at the white wolf standing in the ruins of the archive, at the scattered papers and the broken door, and the cowering wolves, and the scribe bleeding on the floor, at the wolf that was looking back at him with silver eyes that held no submission, and no fear, and no deference, only a steady burning certainty. His eyes went fully amber. His wolf pressed to the surface. For one long moment, 2 wolves regarded each other, across a distance of 8 feet and 6 years of silence, and a war that had been built on lies. Cale shifted. The black wolf filled the corridor the way the man filled rooms impossibly large, impossibly present. He moved through the 12 flattened wolves without looking at them, stepping over bodies as though they were furniture, and stopped in front of the white wolf. He was larger. Of course he was. But not by as much as she expected. Old blood wolves grew to match their power, not their nutrition, and Sarah had been starving for years, and still stood shoulder-high to him. He lowered his massive head, pressed his nose to the side of her neck where the map lines traced the supply routes along the Blackridge border. He inhaled. His eyes closed. Then he turned and placed his body between her and the corridor, between her and the 12 wolves, between her and the world, a wall of black fur and amber eyes, and a heartbeat that said, in a language older than words, behind me, always behind me. She shifted back. The return was easier. She stood naked in the wrecked archive, shaking, and covered in a fine layer of white fur that was already dissolving, and Rin appeared beside her, with a blanket that smelled of horse and road dust, and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. Cale shifted back. He pulled his coat off one of the flattened wolves' backs, where it had fallen, and put it on. "Aldrich," he said. The scribe looked up from the floor. His arm was bleeding from puncture marks that would scar. Lord Gregor is no longer Alpha of Iron Fang. I have presented the original territorial surveys to his own council. 3 of his 6 councillors have already yielded. The other 3 are deciding. The pack is being offered the choice of integration or peaceful departure. He looked at Aldrich with an expression that was not anger, but worse. Calculation. You altered military records during wartime. That is not a pack crime. That is a war crime. My tribunal will determine your sentence. I was following orders, Aldrich said. Yes, that is generally what war criminals say. 2 Blackridge wolves took Aldrich up the stairs. The 12 Iron Fang wolves followed, some limping, all silent. Cale turned to Sarah. She was standing in a blanket in the ruins of her life, shaking not from cold, but from the adrenaline come down, and her wolf was pacing inside her, agitated and electric, and the bond between them was no longer a pull, but a roar. "You are old blood," he said. "My mother was. She never told anyone. She came to Iron Fang because she thought a small pack would be safe. She was wrong. The silver wolf has not been seen in 3 generations. I know. I read the breeding registries." The corner of his mouth moved again, the scarred side, that almost smile. "Come upstairs," he said. "I have something to show you." She should have argued. She was naked under a horse blanket in a destroyed basement, and her wolf had just broken free of a 6-year binding, and she had bitten a man's arm and she was shaking. But he held out his hand, and she took it, and his palm was warm and calloused and steady, and they walked up the stairs together. The great hall was chaos. Wolves' moving voices raised the particular smell of a pack in upheaval, fear and sweat, and the sharp ozone of dominance, challenges being weighed and discarded. Gregor was standing by the stone hearth, ringed by his remaining councillors, and when Sarah walked into the hall, wrapped in a Blackridge blanket, with the Alpha King's hand in hers, his face did something complicated. Not rage, not fear. Something closer to resignation, the look of a man watching the last card turn over and confirming what he always suspected, that the card had been there all along, and he had been playing against a stacked hand. "Gregor," Kyle said. Gregor looked at Sarah, at the blanket, at her hand in the Alpha King's hand. "You stupid girl," Gregor said. But his voice was tired or cruel. For one moment, Sarah saw him clearly a man who had inherited a lie from his father and spent his life maintaining it, because the alternative was admitting that every death in the mountain passes had been meaningless. He was not evil. He was exhausted by the weight of the fiction he had built, and some small part of him, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be a young Alpha before the war, and the lies, and the dead wolves piled up, was relieved it was over. "I preserved your records," Sarah said. "All of them. Not just the ones that prove the border was falsified. The trade agreements, the breeding registries, the crop yields, the tax records. Every document your father and your grandfather and their alphas before them created. I preserved them because they matter. Because you mattered even when you forgot." Gregor looked at her for a long time. Then he looked away, and his jaw worked, and he said nothing. He was led from the hall by Blackridge wolves, not roughly, not gently. Led. Maren walked beside him, and at the door she turned and looked at Sarah, and the expression on her face was the same one she had worn in the kitchen garden at dawn, pressing her forehead to the fence post. Human. Just human. The treaty was signed 3 days later, though it was no longer a treaty between equals. It was a surrender with terms, and the terms were better than Gregor deserved, because Cale was a wolf who preferred to absorb enemies rather than destroy them. Iron Fang would become a vassal territory of Blackridge. Its wolves would be offered full integration. Its lands would be surveyed accurately for the first time in 40 years. Sarah spent those 3 days with Kyle's cartographers. They set up a workstation in the Great Hall, where the light was good, and Sarah stood in the center of it, while 3 map-makers circled her with parchment and charcoal, copying the lines from her skin with the same focused intensity that monks bring to illuminated manuscripts. She stood shirtless in the binding cloth for hours, while they traced the mountain passes, the supply routes, the river crossings, the ambush positions, translating her body back into paper. Kale watched from a chair by the hearth. Not the way a man watches a woman undress, the way a scholar watches a text being transcribed, with reverence and a certain anxiety, the fear that something will be lost in translation. On the second day, while the cartographers were taking a break, and Sarah was stretching her arms to relieve the stiffness from standing still, he crossed the hall and stood in front of her. When the maps are fully copied, he said, "Will you want the marks removed?" There are healers who can do it. Gradually. It would take months, but the scars would fade. She looked down at her torso, at the lines she had carved into herself over 2 years of candlelit nights with a bone needle and a bowl of blood-mixed ink, at the pain she had chosen freely to protect something she believed in. "No," she said. He nodded. He did not ask why. He understood. Some records are not meant to be erased. On the 3rd day, he asked her to walk with him. They walked the perimeter of the Iron Fang territory through the pine forest that smelled of resin and cold earth, and the particular sweetness of decay that meant mushrooms were growing somewhere nearby. Sarah's wolf was fully present. Now sharp and bright and aware of everything, the hawk circling overhead, the rabbit freezing in the underbrush, the way the light fell through the canopy in columns that looked like the bars of a cage, but were actually the architecture of something growing. "I need to tell you something before I ask you anything," Kale said. She waited. The scar on my face was not from combat. The official story is a silver blade during the challenge with my uncle. The truth is that I did it to myself. I was 19. My wolf was emerging, and it was difficult. The dominance was overwhelming. I could feel every wolf in the pack, all the time, their emotions, their submission, their fear. It was like standing in a room where everyone is screaming and you cannot leave. The silver blade was an attempt to quiet it. I thought pain would give me something to focus on besides the noise. He looked straight ahead as he walked. His profile was the scarred one, the right side the one that told the truth. "It did not work," he said, but the scar remained, and the story that grew around it was more useful than the truth, so I let it grow. The Scar King. Fearsome. Untouchable. A convenient fiction like Gregor's Border. Sarah walked beside him in silence for a moment. "You are telling me this because you want me to know you are not what people say you are. I am telling you because you carry your own marks, and you understand what it costs to put them there." He stopped walking, turned to face her. The light through the pines caught his eyes and made the amber translucent. "I am going to ask you to come to Blackridge, not as a prize, not as a rescued Omega. As my mate, if you choose it. As a member of my council, because you understand archives and records and the truth that lives in documents when powerful men would rather it did not. As," he paused, searched for the word, "as the person who reads me accurately. You are the Alpha King. No one reads you. You did, in the corridor, the first time we met. You looked up and you saw the scar and you did not flinch. Every wolf I have ever met either flinches from the scar or stares at it with fascination. You did neither. You looked at it the way you look at a document. Something to be understood, not feared. She felt her wolf stir. Press forward. The bond between them was not a chain or a rope or any of the metaphors the romance books used. It was a frequency, a resonance, like two tuning forks vibrating in harmony because they were built to the same pitch. "If I come to Blackridge," she said, "I want access to your archives." He blinked. "My archives? Your historical records, your territorial surveys, your breeding registries. I want to cross-reference them with the Iron Fang documents. There are discrepancies that predate Gregor's father. The border has been contested for a century. If we are going to build peace, we need to build it on accurate records. You are negotiating terms. I am an archive keeper. This is what I do. You have access to the archives. Full access. Anything else?" She looked at him, at the scar he had given himself at 19 because the noise of other people's emotions was unbearable, at the hands that could crack oak but had touched her arms with the precision of a man handling a first edition manuscript. "Yes," she said. "I want to see your wolf." Something shifted in his face, a vulnerability she had not expected. The Alpha King, the Scar King, the man who made 3 packs, surrender without a fight, looked almost uncertain. He shifted. The black wolf stood in the pine forest, enormous and dark, and breathing clouds of warm vapor into the cold air. His amber eyes were the same amber, but seen through wolf eyes. They were deeper, older, carrying a weight of memory that the human face could mask, but the wolf face could not. Sarah shifted. The white wolf stood facing the black. Old blood, silver white, against Blackridge shadow black. 2 wolves in a pine forest at the edge of a territory that was changing hands, at the end of a war that had been built on lies at the beginning of something that had no map. She stepped forward and pressed her muzzle to the scarred side of his face. Not gently, firmly, the way you press a seal into wax, claiming. Not his body but his truth, the part of him that was real under the legend. His massive head dropped. He pressed his forehead to hers. They stood like that, 2 wolves breathing the same air in a column of pine-filtered light for a long time. The marking ceremony was held at Blackridge 3 weeks later. Sarah had expected something grand, a hall full of wolves, ritual words, the formal bite that every romance in the archive described in loving detail. Instead, Cale took her to the cartography room. It was on the top floor of the Blackridge Keep, a circular room with windows on every wall, and a drafting table in the center, piled with maps and survey tools and the peculiar clutter of people who measure the world for a living. It smelled of paper and ink and the beeswax used to treat the good parchment. "Here," Sarah said. "You carry maps on your skin. I thought you should be marked where maps are made." The room was empty, except for the 2 of them. No witnesses, no ritual, no audience. He stood behind her and brushed her hair to the side. She felt his breath on the back of her neck, warm and steady. His heartbeat, the slow bass drum she had learned to find in any room, was finally running fast. "I have never done this," he said. "I know. I am afraid I will hurt you." "You will. It is a bite. It will heal." His laugh was quiet and surprised, as though he was not used to being made to laugh. She felt the vibration of it against her back. "Ready?" he asked. "Cale." "Yes. Thank you for reading me." His mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder. His teeth broke the skin. The pain was bright and specific, a point of fire that expanded outward, and then it changed, became something else. Not pain, but connection. A bridge completing a circuit closing, and she felt him. Not his body against hers, though that too, but his wolf, his real self, the 19-year-old boy who cut his own face to find silence, and the king who cracked oak tables, and the man who sat outside a locked basement door because a woman told him no. And he listened. She felt all of it. And he felt her. The girl in the basement. The keeper of records. The silver wolf that no one thought to look for, because they were too busy looking away. She reached back and put her hand on the scarred side of his face, and he pressed into her palm, and the mark on her neck sealed. Later in the cartography room, with the maps spread across the table, and the moonlight coming through the windows in silver squares, she showed him the last map. The one she had not shown the cartographers. The one inked across her lower back, hidden by the binding cloth that she had done on the worst night, the night she almost stopped. It was not a war map. It was a map of the stars as seen from the archive basement window, the tiny barred rectangle of sky that was the only view she had for 6 years. She had tracked the constellations night by night, season by season, and tattooed their paths across her skin. A record of the sky seen from a cage. Cale traced the constellation lines with his fingertip. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "We will build a window in our bedroom, a large one, facing north, so you can see the whole sky." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. The scar. The amber. The face that the world feared, and she read like a beloved text. "Not the whole sky," she said. "Just enough to know which way is home." His arms tightened around her. The marking bite on her neck throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Through the cartography room windows, the Blackridge Mountains stood like dark shoulders against a sky full of stars she no longer needed to map from memory. Her hand rested on the table beside an unfinished survey of the newly accurate border between 2 territories that were learning slowly to be one. The ink was still wet. It would dry by morning. Sarah pressed her cheek against the scar on his jaw, felt the raised tissue under her skin, the record he carried, and outside the wolves of Blackridge howled. And for the first time in 6 years, the sound was not a warning, but a welcome, a frequency. She recognized the way you recognize your own name, spoken by someone who means it.